Today we are here to talk about the topic of Putinism, what Putinism is, what's going on for Vladimir Putin in terms of Russian politics today, and those sorts of things. And I'd be very happy to answer your questions as we get through the talk here, okay? Oops, sorry. So I wanted to start, I don't know if any of you have seen this meme that's been going around in social media where on the left side you see what someone's plans were for the year, and then on the right side you see what actually happened in 2020. So Vladimir Putin had big plans for 2020, and it was supposed to come to accumulation about 2 weeks ago on May 9th, which is the day that Russia celebrates Victory Day in the Great Patriotic War over Nazi Germany. So it's the 75th anniversary of that victory this year. And this parade was supposed to be the culmination of a series of events that were supposed to solidify Putin's rule and legitimacy and potentially pave the way for him to rule for another 16 years. But things didn't quite turn out the way that he had expected. Instead, he is like all of us, sitting at his desk talking to people on Zoom. And trying to deal with the coronavirus. So many of his plans have changed. So I'm going to start by talking about in a bit more detail what the goals were for 2020, and then go backwards from there and talk about the system that I refer to as Putinism, and then we'll come again at the end back to where we are today. So there were two big things happening for Putin politically in the first half of 2020. The first was a process of rewriting the Constitution and the fundamental rules of the game in Russian politics. There were several reasons for this, but the most important of which was to put in place a system in which he could potentially continue to rule until 2036. It's not guaranteed that he's going to do that, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But that was how the year started for Russia and Russians. So in January, he announced a series of constitutional reforms. When he initially talked about these reforms, the idea that he put forward was they were actually going to rebalance power somewhat away from the presidency, give more power to the Constitutional Court, give more power to the legislature, and give more power to this advisory body now that's called the State Council. So the reason this was on the agenda was because Putin is constitutionally, or was at that time constitutionally, a lame duck, which meant he was in his last term, which started in 2018 and was scheduled to end in 2024. So I should probably just briefly explain this. According to the Russian Constitution, that was adopted in 1993, excuse me, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, presidents served for 4-year terms, and they could serve a maximum of 2 consecutive terms, okay? So he became president in 2000 after Boris Yeltsin's resignation, served a term until 2004, was reelected, served a term until 2008, and then they faced the issue of what was going to happen going forward because he couldn't run constitutionally for a 3rd term. And that's the period when, you may remember, they had this thing that they called the tandem, in which Putin moved to the prime minister's office, and the person who was the prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, became president. So he got around this limit on 2 consecutive constitutional terms as president by putting one of his loyal members of his team in the presidency, and he became the prime minister. So the Russian Constitution has both a president and a prime minister. It's got these 2 executive positions. So from 2008 to 2012, Medvedev was the president and Putin was the prime minister. One of the first and most important things that Dmitry Medvedev did as president in 2008 was put forward a proposal to change the Constitution to make the presidential terms last from 4 years to 6 years. So that was adopted fairly easily and quickly. And then that meant that in 2012, whoever was elected president in 2012 would serve a 6-year term until 2018. So in 2011, Putin and Medvedev collectively announced that Putin was going to run for president again. And Putin ran in 2012, was elected, served until 2018, ran again, and was elected again for another 6-year term. So that term was going to run out in 2024. At that point, he would not be allowed to continue as president. Okay, and at that point, he would be 72 years old. He's currently 67. And the next president would serve for 6 years until 2030. So there was a lot of discussion about what was going to happen in 2024. When Putin initially announced the constitutional reforms in January, many observers thought he was preparing the way to kind of half leave the presidency. He would take on some other role in the system, perhaps leader of this advisory body called the State Council that was going to get new powers, and that he'd put a loyal successor in place as president. But he surprised many people in March by going to the Duma, which is the lower house of the Russian parliament, and offering his support for a proposal that basically said, because they were going to amend the Constitution, the term limits that were in place for presidents would be zeroed out. So the clock would start over, okay? So the basic idea then would be that even because there was going to be a new constitution, he would be allowed to run again in 2024, and it would count as his first term and not his fifth, okay? So potentially he was putting in place the ability to rule until 2036, at which point he would be in his mid-80s. So those amendments, once he supported them, were quickly adopted. They got the 2/3 votes they needed from the lower house of parliament, from the upper house of parliament. It quickly passed through 3/4 of the regional legislatures, which is the next step in the constitutional amendment process. And the process had the support of the Constitutional Court. So this was all ready to go, okay? Also announced that he was going to have a national plebiscite or referendum to get popular support for these constitutional changes. So the idea was that people would vote for this new constitution, and that would make it legitimate for him to prolong his period in office even longer. And they put lots of other things in the Constitution in addition to this zeroing out of the presidential amendments. There were lots of things that were seen as an attempt to reach out to the population, like putting actually in the Constitution that pensions are indexed to the rate of inflation, so making this actually part of the Constitution. They were also going for various conservative proposals that they thought would get support, like putting God in the Constitution, even though elsewhere in the Constitution it says it's a secular state, banning gay marriage in the Constitution, which was considered to be popular in Russia. So they were putting all these other things in, but the fundamental change was going to be this change in the Putin's presidential terms. So this referendum or plebiscite was supposed to take place on April 22nd, but they had to cancel it because of coronavirus. And so that was supposed to be a big deal for him, this national referendum, which was going to be followed 2 weeks later by the 75th anniversary parade in Red Square of the end of World War II. Coronavirus came along and spoiled all those plans for him. Moscow's in lockdown. A lot of other cities in Russia are in lockdown, although they're starting to open up in some parts of Russia. And they just announced today, actually, this is why my slide is amended at the very bottom there, that the parade they were typically going to have on May 9th is now going to take place on June 24th. So even though the rate of COVID infections continues to be quite high in Russia, and it's not really going down, it's kind of plateaued, but it hasn't started to drop precipitously, he's planning to have a parade in a month on Red Square, and many observers are concerned that this will lead to a new spike of COVID infections in Russia, but he seems to think that this is important for getting the population behind him. World War II is a very fundamental part of his legitimation strategy. All right, so that's an overview of sort of what's happened in the first half of 2020 for Russia. And now I want to move to talking more fundamentally about Putinism as a system. So why does Russia have a political system like the one it does? One that's heavily focused on one man. Obviously, there are many other institutions and actors in the Russian political system, but very much depends on the personality of the leader in charge. Political scientists would refer to this as a personalistic authoritarian regime, okay? And not only that, we have, since Putin's been in power, very much a glorification of military past and a celebration of the victory in World War II, during which 27 million Soviet citizens died. And so this has become fundamental to the identity of the regime. There's a really good book by a Guardian journalist named Sean Walker called The Long Hangover about the use of World War II in building support for Putin. And another thing that I think is really important to notice, and this should have been clear in my discussion of how quickly they amended the Constitution, right? They did it in a couple of months, and really all the key votes took place in a couple of days. The formal rules of the game, the Constitution and the laws, are relatively weak and relatively changeable. And I mean relative to more established, either established democracies or indeed some more established authoritarian regimes like in China. So why does Russia have this kind of system? And I'm going to suggest that the answer is what I refer to as Putinism, both as a mentality and as a system. So I'm going to talk about Putinism in two different ways. The first is the sort of worldview of Putin and the people around him, and the second is the political order that he and the people around him have constructed. So what is Putinism? First thing I want to say is Putinism is not an ideology, okay? And why do I say that? When social scientists think of ideology, they think of a really coherent, consistent, interconnected worldview. Something like Marxism or communism or liberalism as an ideology, other forms of ideology, political Islam might be an ideology, but there's a really consistent worldview that they try and implement in politics. And I don't think Putinism is that. I don't think there's really a well worked out view that they try and carry forth all the time. I think of it in two different ways. The first is as a system of rule, and most fundamentally as a mentality, or what I refer to as a code. And I think of this as kind of the nervous system for the Russian body politic. So the way that the Russian elites and Putin and the people around him understand politics, think about them, feel about them, is what sort of drives the way they do politics, both domestic politics and international politics. So it's the nervous system of the whole thing. So I'm going to make three basic points here today, and let me talk about each of them in turn. And the first one is going to sound super obvious, right? That Putin matters. Everything I've been talking about so far is about Putin. But why do I want to start with that? I want to start with that because there are some other ways of thinking about politics in general, and Russian politics in particular, which would suggest that the personality of the leader really shouldn't matter that much, okay? So for example, very common among some of my colleagues at the Maxwell School is to think of all political actors as sort of rational, trying to increase their power and wealth as much as they can, and any person stuck in that situation would behave roughly the same way, okay? This is a vision of politicians as all kind of trying to maximize their power. And Putin is certainly building power and has built his power, but I don't think if you put someone else in that situation, we would have the same outcome. For example, if Boris Yeltsin had tried to appoint a different successor back in 2000, you can imagine very different trajectories that Russia would have gone on. So I think a lot depends on the personality of the leader in a system like Russia's. The other sort of contrast, besides this view of all politicians as rational actors, is this view that what really defines what happens in a country is its history and culture. Countries are very much constrained by how they've developed and the way people think about politics in the society. So in this view, Putin is not really important as a personality. What matters is he's kind of a continuation of hundreds of years of Russian history. People often talk about, say, for example, Russian desire for having a ruler with a strong hand. And I tend to be skeptical of these more cultural kinds of arguments that suggest that Russians are inevitably drawn to authoritarianism or something like that. I think these were political choices made by a leader and the people around him, and that they were made because of a specific worldview. So that's the sense in which I think Putin matters. His personality drives the system. Second thing is what matters is what I refer to as the code. So this is the idea that there's a set mentality that Putin and the people around him share that drives the way they approach politics. And the code leads to two different outcomes. One, it leads to underperformance at home. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this in my prepared remarks, but I'm happy to talk about it more in questions and answers. And by underperformance, I mean things like how the economy is doing, how well the system is governed, how well they do at basic things like delivering healthcare, building roads, delivering services to the population. And I would suggest that the way Putin thinks about the world and what he prioritizes means that those things are often neglected due to higher priorities. And one of those priorities is foreign policy. So the code leads not only to an underperformance at home, but over ambition abroad. And the sort of middle part of my talk towards the end is going to talk mostly about this foreign policy piece of the situation and also US-Russian relations, okay? So Bill mentioned earlier my book that came out roughly 2 years ago called The Code of Putinism. It's published by Oxford University Press. Bill kindly noted it's available through the County Public Library. I would certainly also note that it's available through Amazon in audio form, in paper form as well, or other sellers of books, obviously, okay? So the code is, the way I think of the code, it's the mentality of what I call Team Putin. Putin and the close circle of associates around him. So what's in the mentality? So here I have to spend a couple of minutes, and I apologize, on social science theory. So there's this very famous German sociologist from the beginning of the 20th century. His name was Max Weber. And in one of his books, he talked about how there are 4 basic motives for human behavior in the world. The first is the one I've already talked about, in which people are rational actors trying to get what they want in an instrumental fashion, okay? So that's one piece of his way of thinking about the motives for human action. And there are many social scientists who sort of stop at that one and think that's the one that we need to pay attention to. But I think the other 3 that he talked about are also extremely important. The first of these are ideas. He also referred to them as values. So it's not simply that political actors or other people are trying to maximize their power or whatever. It's also they have goals in terms of things they believe in and want to see happen in the world, ideas that they're committed to. And I think that's an important part of the motive of many political leaders, including Vladimir Putin. The third piece that Weber talks about is what he refers to as habits or traditions. So we can think of habits as kind of instinctive reactions to stimulus that develop as we grow up, okay? So smoking is a habit that someone acquires, but habits in the sense I'm talking about here are kind of sort of pre-rational, reflexive responses to situations that people find themselves in. And that, I think, also is an important part of a lot of what we do in life, that a lot of what we do, it's because that's the way we've done things in the past. And the fourth piece of it, I call emotions. Weber referred to them as affect, but these are feelings, basically, right? So many of the things we do in life aren't simply because, you know, we're trying to get more power or because it's the way we've always done things, but we've got emotions attached to it, whether it's love or hate or anger or anxiety or whatever. So what I do in the book, and the first chapter of the book in particular, is I try and go through and by talking to experts in Russia, by reading a lot of Putin's speeches and those around him, try and identify some of the core ideas, habits, and emotions that drive Team Putin. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of the nervous system that determines the policies that they try and pursue as they maneuver in the environment that they're in. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the the code, this mentality, this complex of ideas, habits, and emotions that drive the leadership. And in the foreign policy realm, this leads to behavior that one Russian analyst referred to as punching above its weight, that Russia is punching above its weight in the international system. So I will be talking about that a bit later, but that's one sort of consequence of this mentality, I'm going to argue. All right. So I wanted to give you a better sense of what I'm thinking about when I think of this code by giving you a long quote from Vladimir Putin. This is from December 2014. So just a reminder where we were in the world back in 2014. In February, it was the Sochi Olympics, held in Russia, was seen as this signature event for the Russian political leadership. They'd invested a lot of money in it, $50 billion, the most expensive Olympics ever. And it was supposed to be a showcase for Russia and for Putin's leadership. But at roughly the same time, you may recall, there was this political revolution taking place next door in Ukraine. And right at the end of the Sochi Olympics, this revolutionary movement actually toppled the government in Ukraine. The leader, a guy named Yanukovych, fled to Russia with Russia's help. And then shortly thereafter, Russia inserted troops into Crimea, this peninsula in the Black Sea that was part of Ukraine. And Russia basically seized and annexed Crimea, made it part of Russia, and then sponsored a civil war in the neighboring area of Ukraine, in southeastern Ukraine, to try and weaken the new Ukrainian government, which was less friendly to Russia than the previous government, okay? So this all happened at the beginning of 2014. You may recall that summer also there was a Malaysian airliner, MH17, that was flying from the Netherlands to Malaysia and was shot down over Ukraine by the rebel forces. And this led to very strong sanctions against Russia. From the United States, from the European Union, and from some other countries. So towards the end of 2014, the price of world energy started to collapse, and the price of oil dropped by half. And this led to a huge drop in the Russian currency. It lost more than half of its value in the space of about 10 days. Okay, and this happened at the end of November 2014. And so in December 2014, Putin is having his annual press conference. He has this big press conference every year that's a marathon event. It goes on for 3 or 4 hours. And one reporter asked him, and she said, you know, is all this economic trouble that we're having now, is this payback for what we did in Crimea and Ukraine? And here's how he answered the question. He said, sometimes I think to myself, perhaps our bears should just sit quietly, stop chasing piglets around the taiga, and feed upon berries and honey. Maybe they would leave him alone. No, they won't, because they will always try to put him in chains. And as soon as they chain him, they will rip out his teeth and claws. In today's understanding, that would mean our nuclear deterrent forces. And if you've been looking at the cartoon over there, that's kind of how Russia sees what's going on, that Uncle Sam is sort of meddling in Ukraine, and Russia's just this peaceful bear off in the forest by itself. So then he went on. And then after they've ripped out its claws and teeth, the bear won't be needed at all. They'll turn it into a scarecrow, and that will be it. Therefore, it has nothing to do with Crimea. It has to do with the fact that we are defending our independence, our sovereignty, and our right to exist. We want to survive and to fight, or we want our skin to hang on a wall. That is the choice we face. So a very colorful and stark statement of Putin, of his view of the world and what's going on in the world at the end of 2014. The they, if you hadn't figured out, refers to the United States. So one of the core elements of this code in terms of ideas is the suspiciousness of the West and of the United States in particular. And I would even say an anti-Americanism, a belief that the Americans are out to get Russia, weaken it, undermine it, and even possibly dismember it. In fact, the Speaker of the State Duma just 2 days ago was talking about how the United States is trying to dismember Russia. So this is a common theme we see among the Russian political elite and Putin and the people around him, this suspiciousness of the West. A second thing that we see in this quote that I just read is a sense of vulnerability. So I think many of us think of Russia as being this very powerful and aggressive actor in the international system. But Putin, I think, perceives Russia as being in a very vulnerable position relative to the United States and other countries around the world. And I also think he feels vulnerable domestically, which may sound a bit crazy because he's been in power for 20 years now. But I think he thinks the political system is quite unstable and really needs a strong hand to keep it under control, and it needs his strong hand to keep it under control. So there's this emotional feeling of vulnerability as well by Putin. Another thing we saw reflected in that long quote was a resentfulness about how Russia has been treated. And this is very common among the Russian elite, somewhat shared by the Russian population as a whole, but most acutely felt by Russia's leaders, that they have not been treated fairly since the end of the Cold War. And they've been humiliated and dictated to by the West. And Putin now believes he's put Russia in a situation in which it can talk back and not have to take this constant humiliation from the West. So this is another feeling, right? I would call this a feeling that's important to this code that I'm talking about. Now, order and unity I think of as habits, right? And I think this is something that Putin acquired fairly early on in life. He talks about how his getting into judo as a young man gave him a sense of self-order and self-discipline. He went on, as many people know, to join the KGB, where they also inculcated this sense of order and control. Obviously, he grew up in the Soviet political system in which the control of the Communist Party was preeminent, and very much, a stress on the unity of the population. So there needs to be order, there needs to be control, and the people need to be unified as part of the system. So these I think of as habits, right? These are things he doesn't even consciously think about a lot of the time, but they affect what he's doing and what the people around him are doing. And we saw that kind of reflected in the quote I read, where he talked about there are those people who want Russia inside to be turned into a scarecrow, and we all need to unify against that threat from the outside. And then one final idea I think is important is that Vladimir Putin considers himself what in Russia they call a statist, someone who believes in a strong state. We could also perhaps think about this as patriotism, but it's really this idea that the state is powerful, society needs to be subordinate to the state, you need this strong state internally, and you also need to be a strong power externally for Russia to survive. And you saw that reflected in his quote that I read out. In 2003, during his annual State of the Union address or State of the Nation speech that he gives, he talked about how every time Russia was weak internal or externally, right, relative to other great powers, it also faced the risk of internal disorder and collapse. So he sees these two things as very much connected. Russia needs to be strong internally, the state needs to dominate, and it needs to be strong externally as a great power. Otherwise, Russia will be weakened and taken advantage of, and maybe even not survive as a functioning state. So I think we saw all of those sort of components of the code in the quote that we read. All right, now the last quote at the bottom, this is from a Russian journalist named Andrei Soldatov. And he said to the New York Times in an interview a couple of years ago, talking about Russian foreign policy, he said, "It's an emotional story of Russia not being treated like a superpower, and for many of them, it's a personal story." So I really like this quote because, first of all, he stresses it's not just about ideas or interests, it's also about emotions. It's about the way that they feel, and they feel like they've been mistreated. And it's a personal story because Putin and the people around him, a lot of them share similar backgrounds. They had good positions in the Soviet system, then everything came crashing down. And they feel like since then, Russia's been fighting hard to get back this sense of being a great power and being respected around the world. So what are the implications of this code for Russian politics? In domestic politics, it leads to a system that has two elements, and I'll describe both of these elements in a second. The first is what I call hyper-presidentialism, and the second is what I call clan network. So I'm going to set that aside and go on and explain those in just a minute. And then in foreign policy, it leads to this strategy that I've already referred to as punching above its weight. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about the domestic political system and then the rest of the time talking about foreign policy. Okay. So first of all, hyper-presidentialism. what do I mean by this? I mean that the institutions that Russia has, both the ones that Putin inherited and then the way he reshaped him, have put a big primacy on the power of the presidency and weakened other institutions. So if I can go back in history just briefly here, I mentioned earlier that Russia has a new constitution since 1993. It was adopted a couple of years after the Soviet Union collapsed. It was adopted during the presidency of Boris Yeltsin, and it gives quite a bit of power to the president. It makes the president sort of the dominant foreign policy and domestic politics actor, while at the same time as a constitution, it had some novelties from the point of view of Russian constitutional history. It did put in place a series of checks and balances in terms of a legislature, in terms of a constitutional court, and also in terms of regions as part of a federal political system like the United States, right? So Russia has 85 regions, all of which have their own powers, just the way United States, 50 states have their own powers. So the president is the sort of linchpin of the system, but the Constitution also did spell out these powers to other branches, and it also spelled out a series of fundamental rights and liberties in the Constitution. Now, when Putin came to power, one of the very first programmatic statements he made, it was on the eve of the millennium, December 31st, 1999, he said, Russia needs strong state power and must have it. So he made clear from the very beginning that his goal was to strengthen the power of the Russian state internally. And his diagnosis for why Russia had such a difficult time in the 1990s under Yeltsin was because the state had been allowed to become too weak. The way Putin thought about strengthening power very much depended upon weakening the power and autonomy of other actors in the system, okay? So we can imagine a way of thinking about politics in which my power doesn't necessarily come at the expense of your power, in which a series of actors sort of constrain themselves, and through those, the state itself becomes strong, okay? So you have a strong legislature, you have a strong court system, you have a strong bureaucracy, you have an executive branch, and they all sort of work together. But the way Putin thinks of it, all of these other bodies are a constraint on his action, okay? And the state needs to be unified, and it needs to be controlled from one center. So he systematically, during his first term in power, set about weakening the powers of the legislature through a series of reforms, and also through the way they changed the electoral system. He weakened the power of the judiciary and made it more dependent upon the presidency. And one of his key goals was also to weaken the power of the regions. One of the things that happened under Boris Yeltsin was a lot of power went to the regions and out of Moscow, because Russia being the biggest country in the world, it has a very diverse kind of population, very diverse regions with different economic potential, different cultural backgrounds, and that kind of thing. And Yeltsin had once said, you should take as much autonomy as you can swallow. He said that to the regions. Putin thought that was exactly the wrong way to do it, and he went around building power back to the center. He called it creating a power vertical. So the regions were supposed to be not their own independent actors that worked, you know, sort of in combination, sometimes competing with, sometimes cooperating with the center, but should be subordinate to that center. And then there were a series of non-state actors that Putin also systematically weakened. That would be the media. So they managed to take control of all the main television channels during his first term, as well as many of the important print media. Those are all now controlled either by the state or by business interests close to Putin. He set about bringing the system of political parties under control and created his sort of dominant political party, which is called United Russia. They worked to weaken NGOs that worked in spheres that they thought were harmful to the state, such as the environment or human rights and those sorts of things. And he also tried to weaken the power of the so-called oligarchs, the big economic interests that were seen as a major player in the 1990s. So it's not that Russia doesn't have oligarchs anymore. It has very powerful and very rich economic actors, but they all understand that they're dependent ultimately on Putin. So that was the goal, was to make sure the economic and business interests understood that they were dependent upon him rather than what was perceived as the other way around, perhaps, under Yeltsin. And I think Putin did all of these things, and he was successful in doing all of these things, not simply because he wanted to get more power for himself, but he thought this was the way to go about building a stronger state. His idea of what it meant to have a strong state was one that was unconstrained by other actors in the system. And so the code, in terms of its emphasis on statism, another thing I stress is its conservatism. And what do I mean by this? By conservative here, I mean the importance of order, the importance of hierarchy, those sorts of things, right? Whereas liberalism as an ideology stresses individual freedoms, individual liberties, private property rights, the rule of law. Conservatism stresses the importance of order, hierarchy, and domination, okay? So we see that, we see the importance of control and unity, and I think there was also, as I've already mentioned, this sense that the system was vulnerable and needed to be strengthened in a way to keep Russia running and Russia functioning. Okay. This has led to what Putin himself once referred to as manual steering. Okay, so in 2007, when he was getting ready to leave the presidency for the first time, he was asked about his accomplishments, and he said the main accomplishment was that he'd managed to strengthen the state, but he said the institutions of the state are still weak and still need manual steering from the president to control them. So the idea that it's a kind of a hands-on thing running Russia, and you can't just let institutions kind of function on their own. You need to constantly be intervening in the system. So this has made him the sort of one indispensable leader, and he's created a system in which there are no obvious alternatives to his rule. Okay, so that's one piece of the political system, the hyper-presidential system. He started with a base in which the Constitution gave the president a lot of power, and he systematically weakened the power of other actors that might constrain it, because he saw this as necessary to building up the power and capability of the Russian state and unifying Russia. The other piece is what I refer to as clans and networks. So what do I mean by this? I don't mean clans in the sense we think of Scottish clans or anything like that. It's more sort of informal groups of actors, people who went to university together or had the same work background together. They kind of cooperate and advance each other's interests. And one of the things about Russian politics is all of these informal actors are sometimes as important as the formal rules of the game, okay? So we're gonna see here how Putin brought a lot of people with him from his previous career because they were the centerpiece of different clans that bring together different political and economic actors to try and advance their interests. So if you don't like the word clan, you can think of these as networks or groups or teams. But the idea is they exist independent of the formal rules of the political system and try and advance their interests collectively, okay? And one Russian political observer, actually one of Putin's former advisors, once said that Putin had two roles in the system. He's the president of the formal system, right, the hyper-presidential system, but he's also the boss of this informal system of different sort of group networks vying for power. And the important thing for Putin is to manage both of those systems simultaneously. And in some sense, being the boss is more important than being the president, because the informal sort of groupings are at least as powerful as the formal rules of the game, okay? So where were the two centerpieces of Putin's power? They came from two different places. One was from his career in the KGB. So he joined the KGB in 1975 as a young man and worked in the KGB up to 1990, first in the Soviet Union, and then he was based in East Germany in the town of Dresden until the East German political system collapsed in 1989. And then he went back to his hometown of Petersburg, where he grew up, and he got a job working for the new mayor of what was then Leningrad, but became St. Petersburg. And he worked for him until 1996 when he went to Moscow. And he was brought to Moscow actually by people he knew by working in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. So he had these two basic sources of power, people he knew in Petersburg and people he knew in the KGB. And he didn't want to be dependent upon people he wasn't familiar with, because loyalty is really important to him. So if you look at this diagram, I'm not going to try and explain everything in it, but there are a couple interesting things to note. First of all, this is a map of the network connections among various important officials in the Russian government. It was made by a Russian sociologist and a Russian journalist. But it was made in 2011 at a time when Putin wasn't even the president at the time. He was the prime minister. So technically the most important person in the system was a guy named Medvedev. If you look really hard, you can find the little bubble that is Medvedev's name down in the lower right. It's kind of a light blue. But the size of the circles denotes the amount of power and connections the person has in the system. And then the lines show where the connections are. And what this map was intended to show, and I think it demonstrates, is that Putin was still at the center of the system, even though he was no longer president, and that almost all the important connections ran through him. So if I walk through all the different names on there, which I'm not going to do, obviously, most of these people either knew Putin from the KGB or from working with him in St. Petersburg. So he sort of promoted a team of loyalists around him, and those are the people who still very much control Russia. So if we look at the Russian state, the Speaker of the Federation Council, which is like the US Senate, it's the upper house of the parliament, the head of the Security Council and the deputy head of the Security Council, which is a very powerful decision-making body. It's sort of like the US National Security Council, but even more powerful. The FSB, that's the Federal Security Service. It's sort of like a superpowered FBI. It's the successor to the KGB. The head of that joined the KGB in Leningrad the same year Putin did. The head of the investigative committee went to law school with Putin in Leningrad in the 1970s. That's like the investigative arm of, you might consider that part of the FBI as well. But all of these sort of security bodies and state bodies are headed by people close to Putin earlier on in his life. And then if we look at the economy, we see the same thing. So the chairman of Gazprom, which is the state gas monopoly, very important to Russia, is someone from St. Petersburg. The head of Rosneft, which is the main Russian state oil company, that's what it means, Russian oil, is also someone who worked with Putin in St. Petersburg in the early 1990s. Same with the head of the largest bank in Russia. It's a state-owned bank called Sberbank. Transneft is the company that controls pipelines inside Russia. That's headed by someone he knew working in the KGB. Rostec is the main arms manufacturer in Russia. That's also headed by someone he knew from the KGB. And the National Media Group is this big conglomerate of a lot of independent media that controls many important television channels and newspapers, and that's controlled by an old friend of his from St. Petersburg. So he's put many of the important levers of power in Russia in the hands of people that he knew from his past, okay? So this leads me back to the constitutional change that I was talking about earlier. Because the system has been constructed upon this one man who's both simultaneously the president and the boss, and there aren't really any alternative contenders for power, the system faced a crisis. It was not an immediate crisis, but it was a looming crisis, in that by 2024, Putin was going to have to leave power or rewrite the rules of the game. And many of these different networks and groupings were sort of nervous about what was going to happen to their interests if Putin was to step aside. And so shortly after Putin got reelected for the last time in 2018, everyone started talking about how's he going to solve this 2024 problem when he's supposed to hand over power. And the system kind of started to seize up because people weren't doing anything other than sort of mobilizing about what's going to happen if a new leader is chosen. Because Putin was electorally and constitutionally a lame duck. And so the fear was that this conflict between the different clans, as you got closer to 2024, would continue and intensify and destabilize the system. So the idea of rewriting the rules 4 years in advance of 2024 was that everyone would realize the system could still work with Putin in charge going forward, and their interests would be protected by not only the president, but the boss, right? He fulfills these two roles. So these amendments were intended to stabilize this elite conflict. Now, this does not necessarily mean that Putin will run for president in 2024. He could do like he did before and appoint someone he considers a loyal successor and step aside. He'll be 72 at the time. But just giving himself the option makes it possible for him to reassure elites that their interests will be protected under whatever happens after 2024. And I think this reflects the fears of Russian vulnerability that I was talking about earlier. All right. Now I want to talk briefly about foreign policy before we go to questions here, okay? So in terms of foreign policy, we've had a lot of talk in the last few years, especially since the annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of the civil war in Ukraine, instigated by Russia, of being in a new Cold War or returning to the Cold War with Russia. And I'm going to suggest that this is very different in some important respects, one of which is Russia is not like the Soviet Union. It's not an ideologically driven power. There are a set of ideas there, but there's nothing like communism that unifies the system and that everyone is working towards. And Russia is also relatively much weaker than the Soviet Union was. So Russia obviously still has many important strengths. It's the largest country in the world, obviously. Although I would note that when the Soviet Union collapsed and the other republics that had been part of the Soviet Union became independent, countries like Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Belarus, and Georgia, and so on, Russia lost more territory there than makes up the entire European Union. So Russia lost a huge amount of territory when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. It's still a very big country, important in Europe, important in Asia, and important in the Middle East. It's close to all of those regions. It's obviously still one of the two nuclear superpowers, along with the United States. So its nuclear power and military power make it a force to be reckoned with. It controls about 15% of world oil and gas production and sells oil and gas both to the east, to China and Japan, and especially to Europe. So that's important. And it's obviously a country with a deep history and culture that gives it some influence in the world. And here's a picture, again, of St. Basil's, the cathedral in Red Square. So all of those things are strengths. But I think the real important story of the last 40 years in the world is not Russian strength, but one of a loss of Russian strength and one of relative Russian weakness, okay? So if you look at this graph, it shows two things. The dark line is the population of Russia relative to the world population. And the gray line is the size of the Russian economy relative to the world economy. And this includes Imperial Russia, Tsarist Russia, up until 1917, and then after that, the Soviet Union, and then after 1991, independent Russia. And we see if we go all the way back to Peter the Great in 1700, Russia was about 4.5% of the world population and about 4.5% of the world economy. And over the next 200 years, Russia builds itself up as a great power. Its population continues to grow as a percentage of the world population as Russia expands into various parts of Europe and Asia. And also its economic power continues to grow as well alongside that. By the time we get to the middle of the 20th century, Russia kind of peaks at about 8.5% of world population and about 10% of the world economy. So still much weaker than the United States, obviously less populated than countries like China and India, but still a major force to be reckoned with. And when the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, it loses roughly half of its population and about 60% of the size of its economy, okay? Because those were the other republics that became independent in 1991. And we see now that Russia is less than 2% of world population and less than 2% of the world economy. So it's dropped drastically compared to the power of the Soviet Union. And this is why the Cambridge historian Dominique Levin said some years ago that Russia is now weaker than it has been at almost any time in the last 300 years, okay? So yes, Russia is still very powerful, but relatively speaking, compared to the Soviet Union, compared to the United States and our European allies, Russia is quite weak. And the other big story of the last 40, 50 years is not only the decline of Russia, but the rise of China, right? So if we look at China as a percentage of the world economy, it's losing share as the Industrial Revolution spreads through the West. It falls from over 30% of the world GDP to around 5%. But then around 1980, it starts to move up and is now 20% of the world economy, while Russia with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, falls to around 2% of the world economy. So these two countries have sort of shifted places there. So in that sense, Russia is no longer the main competitor to the United States in the international system. But Russia is quite resentful of that fall from power. It feels like it's not been respected adequately by the US and the West since then. So there are a series of things that have been sort of sources of disagreement over the years, over the last 20 years or so, 20, 30 years. The enlargement of the NATO alliance into countries that used to be part of the Soviet sphere of influence, the war in Iraq, in which Vladimir Putin, along with the Chancellor of Germany and the President of France, opposed the US and British war in Iraq. That was another sore point. The war in Ukraine that started in 2014, and here you see the image of the Malaysian airliner that was shot down over Ukraine that summer of 2014. And then Putin's intervention in Syria to prop up Assad starting in 2015. So many different flashpoints in the relationship. But I think it's important to sort of think about how this looks from Putin's point of view. A Russian journalist, a guy named Mikhail Zygar, once said that much of the world sees Putin as some kind of Bond villain, and that Putin likes it that way. In fact, he likes being sort of thought of as this evil mastermind. But I tend to disagree with that way of thinking about it. I don't think he likes being seen that way, and I don't think he sees himself that way. So there's this actor named Nathan Fillion. He was on a show called Castle. I think he's got a new show now. But he was on a show called Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I'm sure all of you watched that back in the 1990s and 2000s. And the creator of that show, a guy named Joss Whedon, once told him, because this actor was playing the bad guy, that the important thing he had to remember was that bad guys don't think they're the bad guys, they think they're the heroes. And I think that's how Putin sees it himself. He thinks it's his role to be the James Bond, protecting Russia from evil influences. And so here's this picture I took in 2011 in the center of Moscow, where someone had photoshopped Putin's head onto Daniel Craig's body from the James Bond films. And the title of the film is called Putin Has Got Your Back. That's what it's written in Russian underneath it there. So I think he sees himself not as the bad guy from the Bond films, the guy named Blofeld in many of the Bond films, but as Bond himself, the sort of super agent who's working to keep Russia safe. And I think it's important that Putin, from his point of view, thinks and also feels, right? It's both an idea and an emotion, that he's playing defense and that Russia is in some sense under threat from outside actors, okay? And the real sore point, I think, is not all of the other things I just pointed to, whether it's NATO expansion or the Iraq war or Syria or whatever. I think it's really that the Russian political leadership and Team Putin think that what the United States calls democracy promotion is what they perceive of as an attempt at externally sponsored regime change, okay? So when the US or the European Union invests in sort of training election monitors or supporting NGOs or human rights and that sort of thing, it's not done because the US and the West believe in those things. It's done as a way to try and weaken Russia from within. And the Russians always refer to the so-called colored revolutions that have taken place in many countries around Russia and in Eastern Europe. So in 2004, the government in Ukraine fell due to a popular uprising. In 2003 in Georgia, in 2005 in Kyrgyzstan. There have been a series of these events where authoritarian governments that were friendly to Russia were overthrown by popular movements. But Putin and the people around him don't believe these are popular movements. They think they're instigated by outside actors and by the US in particular. So here's a group of election monitors in 2011 counting ballots. In 2011 in Russia, they had a parliamentary election in which there was widespread evidence of electoral fraud, and videos appeared online of people stuffing ballot boxes and stuff like that. And that led to a series of protests in Moscow, the biggest protests that Russia has seen since the end of the Cold War, where 80 to 100,000 people out on the streets of Moscow claiming these elections are not fair. And at the time, the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton denounced the elections as unfair. And Putin, when she did that, said on television, said opposition leaders in Russia heard the signal from Hillary Clinton, he was implying, and with the support of the US State Department began active work, okay? So the idea here is that these people didn't come out to protest because they were upset at electoral fraud and because they wanted to have free and democratic elections. They were there because the United States was working inside Russia to try and support these revolutions, because I don't think Vladimir Putin truly believes that these people come out on their own. They have to be there in service of someone else's interests, and he saw the hand of the United States here. So Putin for a long time held a grudge against Clinton for this, and I think that helps explain the context of the interference in the 2016 US election. And the document you see there is the report put out by the US intelligence community in January 2017, explaining Russian intervention in the 2016 presidential election and trying to analyze the motive for that election. In the New York Times, in summarizing the gist of the report, it said, Putin sees the election attack as payback, not offense, but defense, okay? So this notion that Russia was responding to efforts by the US to weaken it and weaken other governments in the region, and that the interference in the US election that took place was in some sense a response to that interference, okay? More generally, I think Putin thinks the current international order that was created in Europe after the end of the Cold War and internationally is too dominated by the United States and Europe and is unfair to Russia and other new powers, okay? So here's another quote by this Russian journalist I referred to earlier, Mikhail Zygar. He thinks the new globalization is just a fig leaf for what's really going on, which is that Western leaders want to divide up the world without him and leave Russia without a slice. And the picture there is a picture of a G20 summit that took place in Australia in 2014. And Putin sort of feels like he's on the edge of the picture there. You know, when you have a wedding, and back when we used to have weddings in person, someone brings a new date to the wedding and you put them on the edge of the picture so you can Photoshop them out in case the relationship doesn't work. So Putin's sort of over on the side in this photo and feels like he's not sort of at the center where he really belongs. So he wants a different international system. And what would a new system look like from the point of view of Vladimir Putin? Before I explain that, I want to say something about this photo. So this is one of my favorite photos of Vladimir Putin, you know, bare-chested on a horse. And it's become kind of a popular one in Russia. And so a couple of years ago, I managed to come across a sweater that had an image like this of Putin on the front of it. And I said to my wife, I said, I want a copy. I want this sweater. Can you get it to me for Christmas? Because this was in late November when I saw this image. And then Christmas came and went, and you know, we opened all the presents and there was no sweater under the tree. And I said to my wife, I said, you know, where's the Christmas sweater, the Putin sweater? And she said, oh, I thought you were joking. And I said, no, I'm not joking. I really want that sweater. So I went out and ordered it for myself, and that's what it looks like. So we've got Vladimir Putin on a reindeer dressed up as Santa Claus and bare-chested, riding across the Russian countryside. Okay. So what does Putin want to see for a new world order? He's been pretty clear about this. When he made a speech to the UN in 2015, he started by sort of singing the praises of the big three, by which he meant Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, and building a world order at Yalta that worked to keep you know, peace in the world after World War II. And so those people around him who've talked about, sort of fleshed out this idea of a new big three, means that for Putin, the United States and China and Russia should get together and sort of set the new rules of the game for the new international order. And you know, there's a couple of issues with that. I think one is that, and this refers back to this notion of Russia punching above its weight. You know, the United States is about 22% of the world economy, and China is about 20% of the world economy. Russia is about 2% of the world economy. The size of the Russian economy is about 12th in the world, close to Italy or Canada. Or if we compare it to US state, the size of the Russian economy is roughly the size of the economy of the state of New York. Okay, So Russia is in some sense arguing for a position in which it's one of the main leaders of the world. And in that sense, I think we could say it's slightly punching above its weight with that aspiration. The other problem I see with that aspiration is that it doesn't give the small countries in the world a say in how the world is governed, right? It says the three big powers should come in and write the rules of the game. And as I've suggested already, I think this overambition is a product of the code of Putinism that I described earlier, and the set of ideas and mentality that sort of motivate Putin and the people around him. Okay.